The cantina smelled of stale smoke and spilled drinks. Commander Zekthara sat alone in the darkest corner, his forearms wrapped around a glass of fermented kala root. The liquid burned his throat, but it helped quiet the memories that never stopped screaming in his head. His chitinous shell was scarred from countless battles. Deep grooves ran across his exoskeleton where energy weapons had nearly killed him. But the worst wounds were the ones nobody could see, the ones that made him wake up screaming every night for the past 5 years. The cantina was busy tonight. Traders from a dozen different worlds sat at small tables, sharing stories and making deals. Most of them were young. Too young to remember the war. Too young to understand what those 3 years had done to everyone who lived through them. Zekthara preferred it that way. He did not want to talk about the war. He did not want to remember the humans. A shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see a young female Veltar standing beside him. She had the smooth, unmarked shell of someone who had never seen combat. Her 4 eyes were bright with curiosity. She held a recording device in one of her hands. "Commander Zekthara?" she asked. Her voice was soft and respectful. "My name is Sylvana. I work for the Galactic News Network. I was hoping we could talk." Zekthara took another drink and looked away. "I do not give interviews. Please, sir. It would only take a few minutes. The people need to know what really happened during the war. The people know enough." He set his glass down harder than he meant to. The liquid sloshed over the rim. "The war is over. The humans won. That is all anyone needs to know." Sylvana did not leave. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Commander, with respect, that is not all there is to know. The official reports say very little about the actual fighting. The government files are classified. But people talk. They say things about the humans that seem impossible." Zekthara's mandibles clicked together in annoyance. "What kind of things?" "They say the humans were different from other species, that they fought in ways nobody had ever seen before, that they were—" She paused, searching for the right words. "That they were terrifying." A cold feeling spread through Zekthara's chest. He had hoped those stories would fade with time, but fear had a way of growing in the dark, spreading from one person to another until it became legend. "You want to know about the humans?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Child, you have no idea what you are asking for." Sylvana activated her recording device. "Tell me." Zekthara stared at the small machine for a long moment. Part of him wanted to smash it and walk away, but another part of him, the part that had been carrying these memories alone for 5 years, was tired of the weight. "Turn that thing off," he said. Her face fell. "But sir, I need to record this for the story." "No." His voice was firm. "If you want to hear this, you will listen with your own ears. You will remember it with your own mind. And then you will decide if the galaxy is ready to know the truth." Sylvana hesitated, then switched off the device. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Zekthara finished his drink and signaled for another. When it came, he held the glass up to the light. The liquid was dark red, almost the color of blood. "I was young when the war started," he began. "Younger than you are now. I thought I knew everything about warfare. I had studied the great battles of history. I had trained with the best military minds in the galaxy. I was certain that the Veltar, Confederation, and our allies would win easily." He took a sip and grimaced. The humans were new to space travel. They had only been beyond their own solar system for 50 years. Our intelligence reports said they were primitive. Violent, yes, but in a crude way, like wild animals. Sylvana leaned forward. "What changed your mind?" "The first battle I fought against them." Zekthara's eyes grew distant. "It was supposed to be simple. We would attack their colony on Kepler 442b. They had maybe 2,000 civilians there, plus a small garrison of Gi soldiers. We brought 10,000 of our best troops." He paused, lost in the memory. In his mind, he could still see the red dust of that alien world, still smell the smoke from burning buildings. "Our plan was perfect. We would attack at dawn, overwhelm their defenses and have the planet under our control by nightfall. The humans would surrender or die. It should have been over in hours. But it was not. Zekthara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, child, if only it had been that simple. He drank again, using the time to gather his thoughts. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he make her understand the horror of fighting an enemy that refused to follow the rules? The humans did not fight like any species we had encountered before. When we attacked their positions, they did not retreat in an orderly fashion like civilized soldiers. They did not surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. Instead, he struggled for words. They became something else. Sylvana was hanging on every word. What do you mean? They adapted. In the middle of battle, they would see our tactics and immediately find ways to counter them. When our energy shields blocked their weapons, they switched to throwing rocks and metal fragments. When we destroyed their vehicles, they fought on foot. When we cut off their supply lines, they ate whatever they could find and kept fighting. Zekthara's hands began to shake. He set down his glass to hide the tremor. But the worst part was not their adaptability, it was their medics. Were there medics? Every species has soldiers who treat the wounded. But human medics were different. They would run into the middle of a firefight to help their injured comrades. We would target their medical stations, thinking this would break their morale. Instead, their medics would set up new stations and keep working. He closed his eyes, remembering a human female with short brown hair and steady hands. She had been kneeling beside a wounded soldier when a plasma bolt had hit the ground next to her. The explosion had thrown her against a wall, but she had gotten up and continued treating the injured man. There was one I remember, a medic named Rodriguez. We had her position surrounded. She was trapped in a bunker with a dozen wounded soldiers. Any reasonable person would have surrendered. Instead, she kept working. For 6 hours, she operated on broken bodies while we fired everything we had at her position. What happened to her? She lived. When the battle was over and we finally breached the bunker, we found her still working. She had saved 8 of the 12 wounded soldiers. And when she saw us, she did not beg for mercy. She asked if we had any injured soldiers who needed medical attention. Sylvana's eyes widened. She offered to help you? Yes. And that was when I first began to understand what we were really fighting against. These were not just soldiers. They were something else entirely. Something that our military training had never prepared us for. Zekthara picked up his glass again, but his hands were shaking too badly to drink. He set it back down and looked directly at Sylvana. That battle on Kepler 442b was supposed to last 6 hours. It lasted 6 days. When it was over, we had lost 3,000 soldiers. The humans had lost fewer than 200. And the worst part? They could have killed us all on the first day if they had wanted to. What do you mean? I found out later that they had enough explosives to destroy the entire mining complex where we had set up our base. They could have buried us all under a mountain of rock. But they did not. They chose to fight us soldier to soldier instead. Sylvana was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Why would they do that? Zekthara looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. That, child, is the question that has haunted me for 5 years, and it is only the beginning of what I need to tell you. Zekthara ordered another drink. The cantina had grown quieter as the night wore on. Most of the traders had left, heading back to their ships or rented rooms. Only a few patrons remained, talking in hushed voices about cargo prices and shipping. Hoots. Sylvana waited patiently. She had learned not to rush the old commander. When he was ready to continue, he would speak. You want to know about the humans, Zekthara said finally. I will tell you about the first human I ever met in battle. His name was Jake Morrison. The commander's voice took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing events from long ago. I was a young officer then, only 30 cycles old. I commanded a battalion of elite Veltar shock troops. We were the best soldiers in the Confederation. At least we thought we were. He paused to drink, then continued. The High Command gave us what they called an easy assignment. The humans had established a mining colony on Kepler 442b. It was a small world, mostly rock and desert, not much value except for the rare metals in the ground. Sylvana shifted in her chair. How many humans were there? Intelligence said maybe 500 civilians and 100 soldiers. We brought 1,500 troops. The odds were in our favor by a huge margin. My superiors told me it would be a good first command for a young officer, a chance to gain experience without much risk. Zekthara's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. The human commander was this Morrison fellow, Captain Jake Morrison. Our spies had told us about him. He was a veteran of several small conflicts. Scarred face, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The humans called him a volunteer, which meant he chose to take the most dangerous assignments. What was he like? At first, he seemed like any other military officer. When we demanded their surrender, he refused politely but firmly. He said his people would defend their home. Standard military response. Nothing unusual. Zekthara stared into his drink as if looking for answers in the dark liquid. The battle began at dawn. We attacked their main settlement from 3 directions. Our energy weapons cut through their defensive barriers like they were made of paper. Their return, fire barely scratched our armor. Everything went according to plan for the first hour. Then what happened? Morrison happened. Zekthara's voice dropped to a whisper. In the middle of the battle, he did something I had never seen before. He changed tactics completely. The commander leaned forward, his 4 eyes fixed on Sylvana. Our energy shields were designed to stop plasma weapons and laser fire. They were perfect protection against any known military technology. But Morrison ordered his soldiers to switch to kinetic weapons. Bullets, metal projectiles fired from primitive chemical weapons. Sylvana looked confused. That sounds less dangerous, not more. You would think so, but kinetic weapons work differently than energy weapons. Our shields let them pass right through. Suddenly, our advanced technology was useless. In 10 minutes, Morrison had turned our greatest advantage into a weakness. Zekthara took another drink, his hands steadier now that he was deep in the story, but that was just the beginning. When we adapted and brought up troops without energy shields, Morrison changed tactics again. His soldiers started using our own weapons against us. How? They captured some of our equipment during the first assault. Any normal species would have tried to reverse engineer it, figure out how it worked. That takes time, sometimes years. Morrison's people had it working in hours. The commander shook his head in amazement. Not only working, but working in ways we had never thought of. They used our plasma rifles as cutting tools to breach walls. They turned our communication devices into jamming equipment. They even used our medical scanners to detect our troops through solid rock. Sylvana was taking mental notes, trying to remember every detail. The worst part was how they fought when things went wrong. When their equipment broke down, they improvised. When they ran out of ammunition, they made weapons from scrap metal and mining tools. When their vehicles were destroyed, they continued fighting on foot. Zekthara paused, lost in memory. I remember watching one of their soldiers, a woman named Lisa Rodriguez. She was their medic, the one I told you about earlier. Her medical station was under constant fire. Her equipment was damaged, her supplies were running low. Any reasonable person would have retreated. But she did not. No. She moved her patients to a cave system and continued working. When her surgical tools were destroyed, she sterilized mining equipment and used that instead. When her painkillers ran out, she found local plants that had similar effects. She never stopped working. The commander's voice filled with something that might have been admiration. But the strangest thing was how she treated prisoners. During the battle, several of my soldiers were wounded and captured. Standard military procedure would be to interrogate them for information, then hold them until the fighting was over. That is not what she did. Rodriguez treated their wounds first. Before asking any questions, before securing them as prisoners, she made sure they would not die. She used her limited medical supplies on enemy soldiers, while her own people were still fighting and dying. Zekthara set down his glass and looked directly at Sylvana. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you defeat soldiers who show mercy to those trying to kill them? The young journalist had no answer. The battle lasted 6 days. By the third day, my troops were exhausted. We had expected quick victory, not a prolonged siege. Our supply lines were stretched thin. Morale was falling. What about the humans? They seemed to get stronger. Morrison organized his people into small groups that could move quickly and strike without warning. They knew the terrain better than we did. They had lived there for years. Every cave, every rock formation, every hidden passage was familiar to them. Zekthara's voice took on a haunted quality. On the fourth day, Morrison did something that still gives me nightmares. He sent a message to our command post under a flag of truce. He wanted to negotiate. A surrender? That is what we thought. My colonel was pleased. He thought the humans had finally realized they could not win. We agreed to meet with Morrison at a neutral location. The commander stopped talking and stared at his hands. They were shaking again. Morrison came alone. No guards, no weapons, just him and a small recording device. He looked tired but not defeated. His uniform was dirty and torn, but his eyes were clear and determined. What did he want? He offered us a choice. We could continue fighting and eventually win through sheer numbers. He acknowledged that his people could not hold out forever, but he warned us that victory would come at a terrible cost. Silvana leaned forward. What kind of cost? He had been studying our tactics and equipment. Morrison told us exactly how many soldiers we would lose taking each defensive position. He described the traps his people had prepared. He explained how they planned to make us pay for every meter of ground. Zekthara's voice became barely audible. Then he offered an alternative. His people would surrender peacefully if we agreed to certain conditions. They wanted guaranteed safe passage for their civilians. They wanted their wounded treated according to galactic law. And they wanted a promise that we would not destroy their colony completely. Those seemed like reasonable terms. They were more than reasonable, they were generous. Any other species would have demanded ransom or territorial concessions. Morrison only asked for basic humanitarian treatment. The commander finished his drink in one gulp. My colonel rejected the offer. He said we did not negotiate with primitives. He ordered Morrison arrested as a spy. What happened? Morrison smiled. Not a happy smile, but sad. He said he had hoped we would choose differently. Then he activated his recording device and spoke a single word. Broken. Zekthara's hands were shaking violently now. It was a code word. Within minutes, explosions began all around our base. Morrison's people had spent 4 days planting charges while we thought we were winning. They could have killed us all, but the explosions were carefully placed to disable our equipment without causing casualties. They could have won the war right then? Yes. But they chose not to. Even when we rejected their mercy, they showed us mercy. They destroyed our weapons and vehicles, then disappeared into the caves. It took us 3 more days to restore communications and call for reinforcement. Zekthara looked up at Silvana with eyes full of fear and confusion. That was my first lesson about humans. They do not just fight wars. They fight them with rules that no other species follows. Rules that make them more dangerous than any weapon. The cantina was nearly empty now. Only Zekthara and Silvana remained at their table, along with a sleeping trader in the far corner. The bartender had stopped cleaning glasses and was listening to their conversation from across the room. Zekthara noticed the attention, but did not seem to care. The alcohol and the weight of old memories had loosened his tongue. For the first time in 5 years, someone was hearing the full truth about the war. After Kepler 442b, the High Command promoted me. He continued. They said I had learned valuable lessons about human tactics. They were right, but not in the way they thought. Silvana waited for him to continue. 2 years into the war, they gave me command of the defense of Vortex Prime. It was the most important fortress world in our territory. If the humans took it, they would have a clear path to our home systems. The commander's voice grew heavy with old pain. Vortex Prime was supposed to be impossible to conquer. We had 3 different species working together to defend it. The Feltar provided ground forces. The Kretok controlled the orbital defenses. The Zephyrians ran the communication and sensor networks. He paused to signal for another drink, though his previous glass was still half full. The fortress itself was built into a mountain, solid rock for hundreds of meters in every direction. The only way in was through a series of heavily defended passages. We had enough supplies to last for years. Our weapons could destroy any ship that came within range of the planet. It sounds impossible to attack, Sylvana said. That is what we thought. The humans proved us wrong. Zekthara accepted his new drink from the bartender, who lingered nearby, hoping to hear more of the story. The human assault was led by General Karen Walsh. They called her the architect because of her ability to find weaknesses in any defense. But intelligence reports did not prepare us for what she was really like. What do you mean? Walsh was not just a brilliant strategist. She was something else entirely. She understood her soldiers in a way that made no sense to us. She knew exactly what each person could do, what they were afraid of, what would motivate them to fight harder. The commander took a small sip of his drink. The siege began with a standard orbital bombardment. We expected that. Our shields held easily. Then Walsh landed troops on the surface and began probing our defenses. Also standard procedure. We were confident we could hold them off indefinitely, but something went wrong. Not wrong exactly. The humans did everything we expected them to do, but they did it differently than any other species would have. Zekthara set down his glass and leaned forward. Most armies would have tried to find the weakest point in our defenses and concentrate their attack there. Walsh did the opposite. She attacked everywhere at once with small groups of soldiers. That sounds like it would spread their forces too thin. It should have. But each group was led by specialists who knew exactly what they were doing. Engineers who could analyze our defensive systems just by looking at them. Soldiers who could survive for weeks behind enemy lines without support. Medics who could treat injuries using whatever materials they found. The commander's voice took on an almost admiring tone. There was one soldier I will never forget. Sergeant Pete Collins. He was a demolitions expert who specialized in structural engineering. During the third week of the siege, his unit was cut off from the main human force. What happened to him? We captured most of his unit, but Collins disappeared. We assumed he had been killed or had fled back to human lines. For 3 weeks, we searched for him without success. Zekthara paused, lost in the memory. Collins had not fled. He had been living in the maintenance tunnels beneath our fortress, eating emergency rations he found in storage rooms, drinking water from the cooling systems, and the whole time, he was mapping every structural support beam in the entire complex. Sylvana's eyes widened. For 3 weeks? Yes. When the human reinforcements finally arrived, Collins had identified 17 critical points that, if destroyed at exactly the same time, would bring down our entire defensive grid without collapsing the mountain on top of us. The commander shook his head in amazement. Any other species would have tried to cause maximum destruction. Collins had found a way to disable our defenses while keeping the civilian population safe. Even our own engineers had not known those structural weak points existed. Did the plan work? We never found out. Collins gave the information to General Walsh, but she chose not to use it immediately. Instead, she continued the siege for another month. Sylvana looked confused. Why? Would she delay if she had a way to win quickly? That is the question that haunts me most about the entire war. Walsh could have ended the siege at any time, but she seemed to be waiting for something. Zekthara picked up his glass but did not drink from it. During that final month, strange things began to happen. Human medics started treating our wounded, soldiers who were brought back from skirmishes. They did not ask for anything in return, they just provided medical care. To enemy soldiers? Yes. There was one medic, Dr. Amy Foster. She worked 18-hour shifts in the human field hospital. But whenever we sent wounded prisoners to them under flags of truce, she treated them with the same care as her own people. The commander's voice became thoughtful. Dr. Foster saved the life of my second-in-command after he was injured in a tunnel collapse. She could have let him die, or demanded military information in exchange for treatment. Instead, she worked for 6 hours to repair his damaged organs, then sent him back to us with medical supplies and instructions for follow-up care. That makes no sense from a military perspective. No, it does not. But it had an effect on our troops. They began to question why we were fighting people who showed such compassion to their enemies. Zekthara finally took a drink, then continued. The siege lasted 4 months total. By the end, something had changed in our soldiers. They were still willing to fight, but their hearts were not in it anymore. How do you maintain hatred for an enemy who keeps proving they are better people than you are? How did it end? The commander was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. The fortress fell when the humans used the most audacious tactic I have ever seen in warfare. They allowed themselves to be captured. What? General Walsh sent a message saying she wanted to negotiate a surrender. Not her surrender, ours. She offered to meet with our command staff under a flag of truce to discuss terms for ending the siege peacefully. Zekathar's hands began to shake again. My commanding officer agreed to the meeting. Walsh came with a small group of advisors. They were searched for weapons, then brought into the heart of our fortress for the negotiations. And then? The negotiations lasted for hours. Walsh presented very reasonable terms. She offered to accept our surrender with full honors. Our soldiers would be treated as prisoners of war according to galactic law. Civilians would be relocated safely. The fortress would be used only for humanitarian purposes. The commander set down his glass with trembling hands. My commanding officer rejected the terms. He said the Veltar Confederation did not surrender to primitives. He ordered Walsh and her people arrested as spies. What happened next? Walsh smiled sadly and said she had hoped we would make a different choice. Then she activated a small device she had hidden on her person. Zekthara's voice became barely audible. It turned out that Walsh and her advisors had been carrying micro-explosives inside their own bodies. Not enough to kill anyone, but enough to destroy the fortress's main power generator and communication systems. Sylvana gasped. They were willing to die? They were willing to do whatever was necessary to end the war. But even then, even when we had betrayed their trust and tried to arrest them, they used only enough explosives to disable our weapons. They could have brought down the entire mountain and killed thousands of people. Instead, they chose precision over destruction. The commander looked up at Sylvana with haunted eyes. The fortress surrendered 6 hours later when human reinforcements arrived. Walsh personally ensured that every defender was treated with dignity and respect. She even arranged for medical care for those who had been injured during the final assault. And that was when you realized? Yes. That was when I understood what we were really fighting against. Not just superior tactics or better soldiers. We were fighting people who were willing to sacrifice themselves rather than compromise their principles. How do you defeat an enemy like that? Zekthara finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. The siege of Vortex Prime broke something in our military leadership. Word spread quickly about what had happened. Other fortress worlds began surrendering without a fight rather than face the humans in battle. Because they were afraid? Because they were ashamed. We had been fighting people who were better than us in every way that mattered. And we knew it. The cantina's lights had dimmed to their lowest setting. The bartender had given up pretending to work and was sitting on a stool, listening openly to Zekthara's story. Even the sleeping trader in the corner had woken up and moved closer to hear better. Zekthara noticed the attention but continued speaking. The memories were flowing freely now, like water through a broken dam. After Vortex Prime fell, everything changed, he said. The war was no longer about territory or resources. It became something else entirely, a test of what we were willing to become to win. Sylvana had stopped trying to remember every detail. The story was too big, too complex for her to capture everything. She focused on understanding rather than recording. The humans changed their tactics completely, Zekathara continued. Instead of attacking our military targets, they began focusing on something much more dangerous. They started targeting our minds. What do you mean? Psychological warfare. But not the kind you learn about in military school. They did not try to frighten us or break our morale through violence. Instead, they did something much worse. They made us question everything we believed about ourselves. The commander picked up his glass, realized it was empty, and set it down again. I was transferred to command a prisoner of war facility on Nexus Station. It was supposed to be a safe assignment. Guard duty, basically. Keep the captured humans contained until the war ended. How many prisoners were there? About 300 humans, all military personnel captured during various battles. They were housed in a secure facility with all the basic necessities: food, water, medical care, recreation areas. We followed galactic law regarding the treatment of prisoners. Zekithara's voice took on a puzzled tone. But these humans did not act like any prisoners we had dealt with before. Most captured soldiers become depressed or angry. They try to escape or they cause trouble for their guards. The humans did something completely different. What did they do? They tried to help us. The commander leaned back in his chair, still amazed by the memory. There was one officer, Lieutenant Commander Ben Hayes. He had been captured during the battle for the Cygnus sector. His ship had been destroyed, his crew killed. He should have been bitter and hostile. But he was not. Hayes was the most polite prisoner I have ever encountered. He said please and thank you to the guards. He organized his fellow prisoners to keep their living areas clean. When new prisoners arrived, he helped them adjust to life in the facility. Zekthara shook his head in bewilderment. But the strangest thing was how he treated the guards. Hayes seemed genuinely interested in our welfare. He asked about our families, our home worlds, our hopes for after the war. He listened to our problems and offered advice. That does not sound very strange. It was when you realized he meant it. Hayes was not trying to manipulate us or gather intelligence. He actually cared about people who were keeping him locked up. The commander's voice became softer. I remember one incident clearly. Corporal Vexton was one of our guards. Young soldier, first assignment away from home. He received news that his parent had become ill back on the home world. Vexton was worried sick but could not get leave to visit. What did Hayes do? He spent hours talking with Vexton about his family. Hayes had lost his own parents years earlier, and he shared advice about dealing with the fear of losing someone you love. He even helped Vexton write a letter home that somehow made the young soldier feel better. Zekthara paused, lost in the memory. Hayes did things like that constantly. He helped guards with personal problems, mediated disputes between prisoners, and even organized educational classes for anyone who wanted to learn about human culture or history. Did this cause problems with discipline? The opposite. The human prisoners were the most well-behaved group we had ever housed. They followed all rules without complaint. They never caused trouble or tried to escape. They actually made our jobs easier. The commander rubbed his temples with two of his hands. But their behavior had an unexpected effect on our guards. Soldiers who had been trained to hate humans began to see them as individuals. It became harder to think of them as enemies when they were helping you solve problems or listening to your troubles. I can see how that would be disturbing. It got worse, much worse. Zekithara signaled for another drink, though he had barely touched his previous one. About 6 months into my command, we received intelligence that a plague had broken out in the Kepler system. My home world was in that system. My family was there. Silvana waited patiently for him to continue. Communications were disrupted because of the plague. I could not get any word about whether my family was safe. For weeks I heard nothing. The uncertainty was driving me crazy. What happened? Hayes noticed that I was distracted and worried. One day he approached me during his exercise period and asked what was wrong. I should not have told him, but I was desperate for someone to talk to. The commander's voice became thick with emotion. Hayes listened to my fears about my family. Then he did something incredible. He offered to help. How could a prisoner help with that? Hayes had been a communications specialist before the war. He knew about signal routing and frequency modulation. He offered to try to establish contact with my homeworld using the prison's communication equipment. Zekthara looked directly at Silvana. Think about what that means. A human prisoner whose people were at war with mine, offering to help me contact my family. He had nothing to gain from it. In fact, helping an enemy officer could have been considered treason by his own military. Did you accept his help? I should not have. It violated every regulation about prisoner interaction. But I was desperate. I allowed Hayes to work with our communication technician to try to reach my home world. The commander's hands were shaking. Again. It took 3 days, but Hayes managed to establish a weak signal. I was able to speak with my family for 10 minutes. They were safe. The plague had not reached our city. And Hayes asked for nothing in return? Nothing. When I tried to offer him better food or additional privileges, he refused. He said he was just glad he could help. He asked only that I let him know if my family remained safe. Zekathara finished his drink in one gulp. That conversation with my family probably saved my sanity. But it also destroyed something else. How could I continue to hate humans when one of them had shown such kindness to someone who was supposed to be his enemy? Did other guards have similar experiences? Yes. And word spread beyond our facility. Other prison commanders reported the same phenomenon. Human prisoners who helped their guards, who showed compassion to their captors, who acted more like guests than enemies. The commander looked around the cantina. Everyone was listening now, drawn in by his story. The most disturbing incident happened near the end of my assignment. We received orders to evacuate the facility because human forces were approaching our sector. During the evacuation, there was an accident. A transport ship carrying some of our guards crashed on a nearby moon. Were they injured? Several were killed. Others were trapped in the wreckage with serious injuries. The rescue mission would take hours to organize. Zekthara's voice became barely audible. Hayes requested permission to help with the rescue effort. He had medical training and experience with damaged spacecraft. When I hesitated, he pointed out that people were dying while we debated. You let him go? I let him go. Hayes and a team of human prisoners worked for 12 hours to extract the survivors from the wreckage. They saved 6 lives that day. The commander looked up with tears in his 4 eyes. One of the guards Hayes saved was Corporal Vexton, the young soldier he had helped earlier. Vexton later told me that Hayes had risked his own life to pull him from the burning ship. And still the humans asked for nothing in return? Nothing. When the evacuation was complete and the prisoners were transferred to other facilities, Hayes simply shook my hand and wished me well. He said he hoped my family would remain safe for the rest of the war. Zekthara wiped his eyes with one of his hands. That was when I understood the true horror of fighting humans. They were not just better soldiers or smarter tacticians. They were better people, and they made us realize how far we had fallen from our own ideals. Is that why the war ended? It was one of the reasons. How do you maintain a war against people who keep proving they are more civilized than you are? How do you justify fighting an enemy who shows you kindness when you show them only cruelty? The commander looked around the quiet cantina. The humans broke us not through superior firepower but through superior character. They won the war by making us ashamed of who we had become. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the station's life support system seemed to have quieted. Everyone present hung on Zekthara's words as he prepared to finish his story. The old commander sat quietly for a long moment, gathering the strength to relive the final chapter of his nightmare. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 5 years of sleepless nights. The war ended not with a great battle, but with something far more terrifying. He began. The humans simply stopped fighting and offered us peace. Silvana leaned forward. That does not sound terrifying. Child, you do not understand what that meant. Any other species would have demanded tribute, territory, or revenge. The humans asked for none of those things. They asked for something much more frightening. Zekthara's 4 hands clasped together on the table. President Sandra Kim gave a speech that was broadcast across the entire galaxy. She spoke directly to every species that had fought against humanity. Her words were simple and clear. The commander's voice took on a formal tone as if reciting something he had memorized. She said that humanity forgave us, all of us. Every act of violence, every war crime, every moment of cruelty. Forgiven completely. She offered full pardons to every soldier who had fought against humans. She promised reconstruction aid to rebuild the worlds that had been damaged in the fighting. That sounds generous, not frightening. You still do not understand. Zekthara's voice became urgent. No species in galactic history had ever done such a thing. When the Kreetok Empire fell, the victors enslaved the survivors for 3 generations. When the Zephyrian Federation collapsed, their enemies stripped them of all technology and left them to rebuild civilization from nothing. He paused to let that sink in. But the humans offered forgiveness and help to people who had tried to destroy them. It violated every principle of how civilized warfare was supposed to end. Why was that scary? Because it meant the humans had been holding back the entire time. If they could afford to be generous to their enemies, what did that say about their true capabilities? Zekthara ordered one final drink, though he seemed too distracted to remember to consume it. 6 months after the war ended, I encountered humans again. I was working as a civilian administrator on my homeworld, trying to help rebuild our damaged infrastructure. That was when I met Rachel Stone. Who was she? Ambassador Rachel Stone was the human diplomatic representative assigned to oversee reconstruction efforts in our sector. She was a former military officer who had fought in several battles against our forces. The commander's voice took on a tone of amazed confusion. Stone came to my office one day to discuss plans for rebuilding our orbital defense platforms. She walked in, introduced herself, and began talking about technical specifications and construction schedules, as if we were old colleagues working on a joint project. What was strange about that? She never mentioned the war, never brought up the fact that we had been enemies. She treated me like a respected partner, not a defeated foe. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her about it, her answer chilled me to the bone. Zekthara's hands began their familiar trembling. Stone said that the war was over, so there was no point in dwelling on past conflicts. She said humans preferred to focus on building a better future rather than punishing people for past mistakes. That sounds reasonable. It was reasonable. That was what made it so terrifying. Stone was working 18-hour days to help rebuild infrastructure that her own people had been forced to destroy during the war. She was using human resources and technology to make our lives better. The commander looked directly at Silvana, but the most disturbing thing was what she told me about human military capabilities. During a casual conversation about orbital defense systems, Stone mentioned that humans had developed weapons capable of destroying entire planets. Silvana's eyes widened. Planet killers? Yes. Stone said the technology had been available for the entire duration of the war. When I asked why humans had never used such weapons, her answer made my blood run cold. What did she say? She looked at me with genuine confusion and asked why they would want to destroy inhabited worlds. She said the point of war was to solve conflicts, not to commit genocide. Zekthara's voice dropped to a whisper. Think about what that means. The humans could have ended the war on the first day by threatening to destroy our home worlds. They could have won every battle by simply exterminating their enemies, but they chose to fight fair instead. They chose to suffer casualties rather than commit genocide? Exactly. The humans lost millions of soldiers in a war they could have won without firing a shot. They accepted years of suffering rather than compromise their principles. The commander finally took a sip of his drink, then continued. Stone showed me reports about human military doctrine during the war. They had strict rules about protecting civilian populations. They refused to attack medical facilities or schools. They even avoided targeting cultural sites that had no military value. Most species follow similar rules. Not like this, the humans followed these rules even when their enemies did not. We targeted human hospitals and schools constantly, trying to break their morale. The humans never retaliated in kind. Zekthara set down his glass and looked around the cantina. But the most chilling thing Stone told me was about human post-war planning. She said they had been preparing reconstruction aid packages for their enemies from the very beginning of the conflict. Before the war even ended? Yes. While human soldiers were dying in battle, human civilians were working on plans to help rebuild enemy worlds. They had medical supplies ready to treat wounded enemy soldiers. They had engineering teams prepared to repair damaged infrastructure. They had teachers ready to help restart educational systems. The commander's voice filled with awe and terror. The humans had been planning to help us from the moment the fighting started. They went to war, knowing they would forgive their enemies and help them rebuild afterward. Silvana was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had heard. Stone worked on my world for 2 years, Zekthara continued. During that time, I watched her solve problems that our own engineers could not figure out. She introduced new technologies that improved our quality of life. She mediated disputes between different factions with wisdom and patience. You admired her? I feared her, because she represented something that I could not understand. Stone was kind, intelligent, and dedicated to helping people who had been her enemies, but underneath that kindness was a power that could have destroyed us all. The commander leaned back in his chair. On her last day on our world, Stone came to say goodbye. I finally asked her the question that had been haunting me for years. I asked her why humans had chosen to show mercy to species that did not deserve it. What did she say? Stone smiled sadly and said that mercy was not about what people deserved. She said humans showed mercy because that was who they chose to be, regardless of how others treated them. Zekthara's voice became barely audible. Then, she said something that still gives me nightmares. She said that humans could have been monsters if they had wanted to. They had the technology and the capability for unlimited destruction, but they chose to be something else instead. What did she mean? She meant that human kindness was not weakness. It was a choice made by people who could afford to be cruel, but decided to be compassionate instead. The commander finished his drink and stood up slowly. That child is why the galaxy still fears humans. Not because of what they did during the war, but because of what they chose not to do. They proved that mercy can be more terrifying than violence. Zekthara looked down at Sylvana one last time. The humans won the war by showing us who we could become if we were brave enough to choose compassion over conquest. They made us realize that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to forgive. He turned to leave, then paused. Write your story if you must. But remember this. We did not lose to human weapons or tactics. We lost to human conscience. And that is the most frightening defeat of all. With those words, Commander Zekthara walked out of the cantina, leaving Sylvana alone with the weight of truth and the terrible beauty of what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had forgotten how to forgive. Outside the cantina, human ships continued their peaceful missions among the stars, carrying aid to former enemies and extending friendship to species that whispered fearful stories about the day they learned that mercy was the most powerful weapon in the universe.